The letter trembled in Florence Harper's gloved hands as she stood on the wooden platform of the train station in St. Louis, Missouri, wondering if she had made the most foolish decision of her entire 22 years of life. September 1878 had arrived with a crispness that promised autumn, but where she was headed, the heat would still be unbearable, the land unforgiving, and everything she knew about civilization would be left behind with each mile. The iron horse carried her westward toward Arizona territory, and a man named Harrison Jameson, whom she had never met. Her Aunt Martha had warned her against this desperate measure, but what choice did Florence truly have? After her father's death, 6 months prior, the debts he had hidden so carefully came crashing down upon their modest Boston household like an avalanche. Her mother had passed when Florence was only 9, leaving her father to raise her alone while working as a clerk in a shipping office. The life insurance barely covered the funeral expenses, and the landlord had given her 30 days to vacate the only home she had ever known. Her father's brother refused to take her in, claiming he had enough mouths to feed with his own 7 children, and her Aunt Martha, though sympathetic, lived in a boarding house with barely enough room for herself. So Florence had done what thousands of other women in her predicament had done. She had answered an advertisement in the matrimonial news seeking a wife for a cattle rancher in Jerome Junction, Arizona territory. The letters that followed had been brief, but respectful. Harrison Jameson wrote in a clear, educated hand that surprised her. He owned a ranch outside the small mining and ranching town, raising cattle and horses. He was 30 years old, had never been married, and sought a wife to help build a proper home and perhaps, in time, a family. He made no promises of love, but he offered security, shelter, and a fresh start. Florence had written back honestly about her circumstances, her lack of experience with frontier life, and her education, which consisted of reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic domestic skills suitable for city living. She could embroider beautifully, play the piano moderately well, and speak a bit of French, none of which would likely prove useful in the Arizona desert. She could cook simple meals but had never butchered an animal, never drawn water from a well, never dealt with creatures more threatening than the occasional mouse in the pantry. Harrison's response had been swift. He did not need a woman who could speak French or play piano. He needed someone honest, willing to work hard and brave enough to face a life that would be nothing like what she had known. He sent money for her passage and asked only that she send a telegram when she departed so he would know when to meet her train. Now, as Florence clutched her single carpetbag containing all her worldly possessions, she questioned that bravery he assumed she possessed. The stories she had heard about the frontier terrified her. Indians on the warpath, outlaws and desperados, scorpions and rattlesnakes, sandstorms and droughts, isolation so complete that some women went mad from the loneliness. She had read accounts of homesteaders found dead in their cabins, of stage coaches robbed and passengers murdered, of entire families wiped out by disease or violence or simple bad luck. But the alternative was worse. Without family or funds, she would have ended up in one of the factories, working 16-hour days in dangerous conditions for wages that would barely keep her fed, living in a tenement with 10 other girls in similar circumstances. Or worse still, she might have been forced into one of the brothels that operated in the shadows of even respectable Boston neighborhoods, where desperate women sold the only thing they had left to sell. At least Harrison Jameson offered marriage, respectability, and the chance for a decent life. Even if that life terrified her, the conductor called for boarding and Florence forced her feet to move toward the train. The journey would take several days, with changes in Kansas City, and then again before the final leg to Jerome Junction. She had never traveled farther than Providence, Rhode Island, for a cousin's wedding when she was 16. Now she was crossing half a continent to marry a stranger. The train car was surprisingly comfortable, with upholstered seats and large windows that would allow her to watch the landscape transform as they traveled west. Florence found a seat near the window and arranged her skirts, the deep blue traveling dress already feeling too warm despite the moderate temperature. She wondered what the heat in Arizona would feel like, how she would manage wearing proper clothing in such an unforgiving climate. As the train lurched into motion, Florence watched the familiar buildings of St. Louis slide past, then give way to open countryside. Her stomach churned with anxiety and something else she could not quite name. Fear, certainly, but perhaps also a tiny spark of excitement. For all her terror, there was something undeniably thrilling about setting out on such an adventure, about leaving behind everything familiar and stepping into a completely new life. The woman sitting across from her, a stout matron with kind eyes and graying hair tucked under a practical bonnet, smiled sympathetically. "First time out west, dear," Florence nodded, not trusting her voice. "You have the look of a mail-order bride, if you do not mind my saying so," the woman continued gently. "I was one myself, 20 years ago. Came out to Kansas to marry a farmer I had never met. Scared me half to death, I can tell you. And how did it turn out?" Florence asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's smile widened. "We just celebrated our 20th anniversary last month. Have 4 grown children now and 3 grandchildren. My Walter turned out to be the best man I could have hoped for. Patient, hardworking kind. Not romantic in the storybook sense, mind you, but he has taken care of me and loved me in his way, and I have loved him in return. It is not always easy, the frontier. But if you have a good man and you are willing to work together, you can build something fine." The reassurance helped settle Florence's stomach slightly. "I am going to Arizona Territory, to Jerome Junction. Mining and ranching country," the woman said, nodding. "Hot and dry but beautiful in its own way. Not like the green hills of home, I expect, but the desert has its charms. You will need to be careful of the sun at first. It will burn your skin something fierce if you are not cautious. And drink plenty of water, more than you think you need. The dryness sneaks up on you." "Thank you," Florence said gratefully. "I confess I know very little about what to expect." "Your husband will teach you," the woman assured her. "What is his occupation?" "He raises cattle and horses on a ranch outside of town." "A rancher," the woman said approvingly. "Good, honest work. He will be outdoors most of the time, which means you will be managing the household largely on your own." "Can you cook?" "Simple things," Florence admitted. "But I have never cooked over a wood stove or open fire. We had a modern kitchen in Boston." "You will learn," the woman said confidently. "Necessity is a fine teacher. Just remember, men who work hard outdoors need substantial meals. Plenty of meat, beans, bread, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Do not try to get fancy at first. Master the basics and you will do fine." Over the next hours, as the train rolled steadily westward, the kind woman, whose name was Mrs. Patterson, shared a wealth of practical advice. How to make soap from lye and animal fat. How to preserve food without ice. How to recognize the signs of various illnesses and treat them with common remedies. How to deal with the isolation and loneliness that could overwhelm even the strongest woman. "The hardest part is not the work, Mrs. Patterson said as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "The work keeps you busy, keeps your hands and mind occupied. The hardest part is the fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of the dangers that lurk in wild places. But I will tell you a secret, dear. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing what needs to be done despite the fear. And if you are lucky enough to have a good man beside you, he can lend you his courage when yours falters, and you can do the same for him. The words stayed with Florence long after Mrs. Patterson departed the train in Kansas City, heading north to visit her daughter. Florence continued westward, changing trains and watching as the landscape grew increasingly foreign. The rolling farmland gave way to flat prairies that stretched endlessly in all directions. Then came the first hints of true wilderness, land that looked untouched by human hands, where buffalo still roamed in vast herds, and the sky seemed impossibly large. With each passing mile, Florence's anxiety grew. What if Jameson took one look at her and was disappointed? She was not beautiful, merely pleasant-looking with brown hair, gray eyes, and features that were unremarkable. She was too thin, her figure more suited to the fashions of 20 years prior than the current styles that favored more womanly curves. What if she proved useless on the ranch, unable to adapt to this harsh new life? What if she made a terrible mistake and ended up trapped in a miserable marriage thousands of miles from anything familiar? But then she would remember her alternatives, and the fear of the unknown seemed preferable to the certainty of the fate that awaited her back east. At least here she would have a chance. At least here she would be a wife, not a factory drudge or worse. The final leg of the journey took her through New Mexico territory and finally into Arizona. The landscape transformed into something entirely alien to her eastern eyes. Red rock formations jutted from the earth like the bones of ancient giants. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels, their arms raised to the cloudless sky. The heat, even in September, was staggering. The few other passengers on this portion of the journey were hardened-looking individuals, men in dusty clothes with weapons openly displayed, women with weathered faces and hands that spoke of years of hard labor. Florence felt more out of place with each passing hour. Her city clothes, though she had chosen her most practical garments, marked her as an outsider. Her soft hands and pale skin proclaimed her ignorance of physical labor and outdoor life. She caught a few of the other passengers glancing at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. And once, from a rough-looking man with cold eyes, something that made her skin crawl until he finally departed the train at a tiny settlement that barely deserved the name. Finally, 3 days after leaving St. Louis, the conductor called out, "Jerome Junction, Arizona Territory. End of the line for this run." Florence's heart hammered against her ribs as she gathered her belongings and stepped down from the train onto a wooden platform that was little more than a few rough planks. The heat hit her like a physical blow, dry and intense, making her feel as though she had stepped into an oven. The sun blazed from a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and dust swirled in small eddies kicked up by the hot wind. The town itself was a collection of rough buildings lining a single main street. A general store, a saloon, a hotel, a blacksmith, a few other establishments she could not immediately identify. Everything looked weathered and temporary, as though a strong wind might blow it all away. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks sharp against the brilliant sky. The whole scene looked nothing like any place Florence had ever been, as foreign as if she had traveled to another country entirely. She scanned the handful of people near the station, searching for a man who might be Jameson. Her instructions had been simply to meet him at the station. He had not described himself beyond saying he was tall and would be wearing a brown hat, which described half the men in sight. Then a man separated himself from the shade of the station building and walked toward her, and somehow Florence knew immediately that this was him. He was indeed tall, at least 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean build that spoke of hard physical labor. He wore dusty brown trousers, a faded blue shirt, scuffed boots, and yes, a brown hat that shaded his face from the sun. As he drew closer, she could make out his features. A strong jaw, sun-bronzed skin, dark hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar, and eyes that were a startling blue-green, the color of the ocean on a cloudy day. He stopped a few feet away and removed his hat, revealing more of that dark hair and a face that, while not classically handsome, was pleasant and open. He looked nervous, she realized with some surprise, his hands gripping the brim of his hat tightly. "Miss Harper." His voice was deep and quiet, with a slight drawl that sounded nothing like the clipped Boston accent she was accustomed to. "Yes," Florence managed, her throat dry from more than just the heat. "Mr. Jameson." "Harrison, please," he said, and offered a tentative smile that transformed his face, making him look younger and less intimidating. "We are to be married, after all. Seems foolish to stand on formality." "Florence," she replied, attempting her own smile despite her trembling nerves. They stood there awkwardly for a moment, two strangers about to bind their lives together, until Harrison cleared his throat. "I have a wagon waiting. The ranch is about an hour outside of town. I thought, if you are not too tired from your journey, we could head there directly. But if you prefer, we could get a room at the hotel for tonight and you could rest." The thought of spending the night in a hotel room, presumably with this man who was still a stranger regardless of their impending marriage, made Florence's cheeks flush. "The ranch is fine," she said quickly. "I would like to see my new home." Something flickered in Harrison's eyes, relief perhaps, and he nodded. "Let me take your bag." He reached for her carpetbag, and Florence handed it over, noticing how easily he lifted it despite it being quite heavy. He gestured toward a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses, and she followed, acutely aware of the curious stares from the few townspeople nearby. No doubt her arrival would be the subject of gossip for days. Harrison helped her up onto the wagon seat with unexpected gentleness, his hand warm and rough against hers even through her gloves. He stowed her bag in the back, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they pulled away from the station, Florence took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was it. There was no turning back now. They rode in silence for the first several minutes, leaving the small town behind and heading out into open country. The landscape was stunning in its starkness. All red earth and scattered vegetation, mountains in the distance, and that endless sky overhead. It was also utterly empty of human presence, the isolation nearly overwhelming after a lifetime spent in cities and towns where neighbors lived within shouting distance. "I know this is not what you are accustomed to," Harrison said finally, breaking the silence. His eyes remained on the road ahead, but she could hear something in his voice, an apology perhaps, or at least an acknowledgement of what she had given up to come here. "It is rough country and the life is hard, but I will do my best to provide for you and keep you safe." "I appreciate that," Florence said, her voice sounding small in the vastness. "I confess I am quite frightened. Everything is so different from Boston." "I expect it is," Harrison agreed, "but you came anyway. That took courage." "Or desperation," Florence said before she could stop herself, then immediately regretted the words. But Harrison did not seem offended. "Sometimes there is not much difference between the two," he said quietly. "I suppose I was a bit of both when I placed that advertisement. Desperate for a partner to help build something lasting and maybe courageous enough or foolish enough to think a woman might actually answer." His honesty surprised and oddly comforted her. "Several women answered, 3, Harrison admitted, "but your letter was the most honest." The others painted pretty pictures of their accomplishments and virtues. You simply told the truth about your situation and admitted you knew nothing about ranch life. I appreciated that. I am not sure honesty is much of a virtue when it means admitting to being utterly unprepared for what I have undertaken, Florence said ruefully. Harrison actually smiled at that, a quick flash of warmth. Being willing to learn counts for more than pretending to knowledge you do not have. And I do not expect you to know everything immediately. I expect it will take time for both of us to adjust to having another person around. You live alone? Florence asked. I have a hand who helps with the cattle, name of Miguel. Good man, been with me for 3 years. He has a small cabin on the far side of the property. Otherwise, yes, it has just been me since I proved up the homestead claim 5 years ago and bought the additional land to expand the ranch. Where are you from originally? Florence asked, curious about this man she was about to marry. Kansas, originally. My father was a farmer, had a small place outside Wichita. I was the youngest of 4 boys, which meant there was not much for me there. My oldest brother inherited the farm, as is proper, and my other brothers found work in town. I headed west to find my own fortune when I was 19. Worked as a ranch hand in Texas for a few years, saved my money, then came here when the government was offering homestead claims. This seemed like good country for cattle, near enough to the mining operations in Jerome to have a market for beef, far enough from the worst of the Apache troubles to be relatively safe. Relatively safe. Florence's voice rose slightly despite her attempt to remain calm. Harrison glanced at her, and she saw sympathy in those unusual eyes. We have not had serious trouble in this area for over a year. Most of the Apache are on reservations now, and the ones who are not have moved farther south. I am not saying there is no danger, but it is not like it was 5 or 10 years ago. The biggest threats these days are rustlers and the occasional outlaw passing through, and we are fortunate that Jerome Junction has a decent sheriff who keeps most of that element under control. Florence tried to feel reassured, but the very fact that he had to explain about Indians and outlaws made her realize just how foreign this world truly was. In Boston, the greatest dangers were pickpockets and the occasional bar fight, not armed men stealing cattle or worse. The ranch, when they finally arrived, was both better and worse than Florence had imagined. The house itself was a simple structure of adobe and wood, larger than a cabin but hardly a mansion. It had a covered porch running along the front, which Harrison explained was essential for creating shade. Behind the house stood a barn, a corral with several horses, and various outbuildings whose purposes Florence could not immediately determine. But the setting was undeniably beautiful. The house nestled in a small valley with a creek running through it, the water a precious ribbon of life in this dry land. Cottonwood trees grew along the creek bank, their leaves rustling in the hot wind. The mountains rose dramatically in the distance, their red rock faces glowing in the afternoon sun. The creek runs year-round, Harrison said, helping her down from the wagon. That is why I chose this spot for the homestead. Water is everything out here. Without it, you have nothing. Florence nodded, understanding the logic even if she had never before had to think about where water came from. In Boston, it simply appeared when you turned a tap. Harrison carried her bag up to the house and opened the door, gesturing for her to enter first. The interior was dim after the brilliant sunshine outside, and it took a moment for Florence's eyes to adjust. When they did, she found herself in a large main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all in one. A wood stove occupied one corner, a rough-hewn table with 4 chairs stood in the center, and a pair of worn but comfortable-looking chairs flanked a small fireplace on the far wall. Shelves held dishes, food supplies, and a few books. The floor was packed earth covered with simple woven rugs. Everything was clean but spare, functional rather than decorative. 2 doors led off the main room. "That is the bedroom," Harrison said, pointing to one. "And that is a storage room, but I thought if you wanted we could convert it into a second bedroom. I thought you might prefer." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Florence felt her cheeks flame as she understood his meaning. He was offering her a separate bedroom, not demanding immediate consummation of their marriage. The relief was enormous. "That is very considerate," she managed. "We barely know each other," Harrison said quietly. "I thought we might take some time, let you get settled before the marriage is fully." He cleared his throat, his own face reddening. "I will sleep in the storage room for now. You take the bedroom." The awkwardness between them was palpable, but Florence appreciated his thoughtfulness more than she could express. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "That eases my mind considerably." Harrison nodded, looking relieved to have that settled. "You must be hungry. Let me fix something to eat." To Florence's surprise, Harrison proved quite capable in the kitchen, putting together a simple but filling meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread, with coffee that was indeed as strong as Mrs. Patterson had predicted. They ate mostly in silence, the weight of unspoken questions and uncertainties hanging between them. After the meal, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Harrison showed her around the rest of the property. The barn housed 3 horses in addition to the 2 that had pulled the wagon, as well as supplies of feed and equipment. The chicken coop held a dozen hens that would provide eggs. The smokehouse contained cured meat. A vegetable garden, looking somewhat neglected, struggled in a patch near the house. "I have not had much luck with the garden," Harrison admitted. "I keep meaning to spend more time on it, but the cattle take most of my attention. Maybe you will have better success." Florence looked at the struggling plants and doubted her own abilities in that regard, but she nodded. "I can try." As darkness fell, bringing a welcome drop in temperature, they returned to the house. Harrison lit a few oil lamps, casting everything in a warm, flickering glow. The night sounds of the desert drifted through the windows, unfamiliar and slightly unsettling to Florence's city ears. "I suppose we should discuss the practical matters," Harrison said, settling into one of the chairs. "The wedding, for instance. I spoke with the Reverend in town last week. He can perform the ceremony any time we are ready. Tomorrow, if you wish, or we could wait a few days if you prefer." Florence considered. Waiting would give her more time to adjust, to know this man better. But it would also prolong the awkwardness of their current situation, living together but not married. "Tomorrow is fine," she said. "No sense in delaying." Harrison nodded. "All right then. We will ride into town in the morning. Afterward, I thought we might visit the general store so you can purchase anything you need for the house or yourself. I know you could not bring much with you." "That is very generous," Florence said. "You are going to be my wife," Harrison replied simply. "Taking care of you is my responsibility." The words, though practical rather than romantic, warmed something in Florence's chest. He was a good man, she thought. Perhaps not the husband she had dreamed of in her youth, when she still believed in fairy tales and perfect love. But a good man nonetheless, honest and kind and trying his best in an awkward situation. That night, lying in the bedroom that would be hers for the foreseeable future, Florence listened to the unfamiliar sounds outside. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries eerie and wild. Something rustled in the brush near the house, probably a small animal, but her imagination conjured larger, more dangerous possibilities. The wind had picked up, whistling around the eaves and making the whole structure creak. She thought of her little room in Boston, with its familiar sounds of city life, voices of neighbors, the clatter of wagons on cobblestone streets, the distant whistle of factory horns marking the changing shifts. That world seemed impossibly far away now, as distant as the moon. Fear crept up her throat, threatening to choke her. What had she done? How could she possibly survive in this harsh, alien place? She was utterly unprepared, completely out of her element, dependent entirely on a man she had met just hours ago. But then she heard Harrison moving around in the main room, the sounds of him preparing to sleep in the storage room he had given up for her comfort. She thought of his quiet courtesy, his attempts to ease her fears, his admission of his own desperation and need. He was not a frightening man. He was just a man trying to build a life in a difficult place, and he had offered to let her be part of that life. Florence took a deep breath, forcing down the panic. She had survived her father's death, the loss of her home, the long, frightening journey west. She could survive this too. She had to. The next morning, Harrison woke her with a gentle knock on the door. "Florence, I have breakfast ready. We should leave for town in about an hour if we want to catch the Reverend before he gets busy with other duties." Florence dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a deep green cotton that was wrinkled from the carpetbag but still respectable. She did what she could with her hair, pinning it up in a simple style, and tried to ignore the trembling of her hands. When she emerged, Harrison was already dressed in what were apparently his best clothes, dark trousers and a white shirt that looked freshly washed. He had shaved and combed his hair, and Florence realized for the first time that he was actually quite attractive in a rough, weathered way. He looked at her and something flickered in his eyes, appreciation perhaps. "You look very nice," he said, his voice carrying a hint of shyness. "Thank you," Florence replied. "As do you." They ate breakfast quickly, more from nerves than hunger, then set out in the wagon for the ride back to Jerome Junction. The morning air was already warm, promising another scorching day. Florence tried to calm her racing heart, reminding herself that this was the right decision, possibly the only decision available to her. The town was busier than it had been the previous afternoon, with people going about their business, wagons delivering goods, miners heading to or from their shifts in the nearby hills. Harrison drove directly to the small church at the end of the main street, a simple white building with a cross mounted above the door. Reverend Thomas was a kindly man in his 50s who greeted them warmly and showed no surprise at their situation. Mail-order marriages were common enough on the frontier that they barely raised an eyebrow. "Do you have witnesses?" he asked. "I asked Miguel to meet us here," Harrison said, just as a man appeared in the church doorway. Miguel was perhaps 40, with weathered brown skin and intelligent dark eyes. He greeted Harrison warmly in slightly accented English, then removed his hat and bowed politely to Florence. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Harrison is a good man. You will be happy here, I think." His certainty was touching, even if Florence did not entirely share it. The Reverend also enlisted his wife as a second witness, and the small group gathered before the simple altar. The ceremony itself was brief and unsentimental. Reverend Thomas read the traditional vows, and Florence found herself promising to love, honor, and obey this man she barely knew. Harrison's voice was steady as he made his own promises, his hand warm and slightly rough as he slid a simple gold band onto her finger. She wondered where he had gotten it, whether it had belonged to his mother, or if he had purchased it especially for this occasion. Then the Reverend was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Harrison was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. He leaned forward and pressed a chaste kiss to her cheek, his lips barely grazing her skin, his beard rough against her face. It was done. She was married. Miguel congratulated them both, his smile genuine. "You come to dinner next week," he told Florence. "My wife will want to meet you. We live just on the other side of Harrison's land." "You are married?" Florence asked, surprised. Harrison had said Miguel lived alone in a cabin. "To a woman from town," Miguel explained. "She did not want to live so far from her family, so I stay at the ranch during the week and go to her on Sundays. It is not perfect, but we make it work." He shrugged philosophically. After the ceremony, Harrison led Florence to the general store as promised. The proprietor, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, greeted Harrison familiarly and looked at Florence with undisguised curiosity. "This is my wife, Florence," Harrison said, and Florence felt a small thrill at hearing herself called that. "She will need some things suitable for ranch life." Over the next hour, with Harrison's patient guidance and the proprietor's suggestions, Florence selected several practical cotton dresses designed for work rather than fashion, sturdy boots, a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun, gloves, various undergarments, and numerous household supplies. Harrison also insisted she pick out material and thread for sewing, explaining that she would need to make and mend clothes regularly. The total cost was substantial, but Harrison paid without hesitation, adding bags of flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples to the order. As they loaded everything into the wagon, Florence felt overwhelmed by his generosity, by the reality of her new life settling over her like a heavy blanket. The ride back to the ranch passed in comfortable silence. Florence found herself stealing glances at the man beside her, her husband now, trying to reconcile the reality with the fears she had harbored. He had been nothing but kind and patient, giving her no reason for her anxiety beyond the general terror of her situation. When they arrived back at the ranch, Harrison helped her carry all the packages inside. "I need to ride out and check on the cattle," he said. "I will be gone most of the afternoon. Will you be all right here alone?" The thought of being left alone in this strange place frightened Florence, but she forced herself to nod. "I will be fine. I can put away these supplies and begin to familiarize myself with the house." Harrison hesitated, as though he could sense her fear. "The rifle is above the door, loaded. Do not touch it unless you absolutely must. There is a bell on the porch. If you need help for any reason, ring it. Miguel will hear it and come, but honestly, you should be perfectly safe. We have never had trouble here at the house." With those less than entirely comforting words, Harrison headed out, leaving Florence alone in her new home. She stood in the middle of the main room for a long moment, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on her. Then she forced herself into motion. Standing idle would only give her fear room to grow. She spent the afternoon unpacking and organizing, finding places for the new supplies, examining the contents of the existing shelves. Harrison's pantry was surprisingly well stocked with basics: beans, flour, cornmeal, coffee, sugar, salt, lard. He had been living as a bachelor, but he had not been starving. The bedroom she had slept in was furnished simply with a sturdy bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a basin and pitcher for washing. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses on pegs along the wall, placing her hairbrush and few toiletries on the table. The room now contained the sum total of her earthly possessions, and it was shockingly little. As the afternoon wore on, Florence decided to attempt making bread, thinking it would be a useful contribution and help pass the time. She had made bread before, though not often, and she found the process soothing. Mixing the dough, kneading it, shaping it into loaves, gave her hands something to do and her mind a focus beyond her fears. She had the loaves rising when she heard a sound outside that froze her blood. A rattling noise, dry and threatening, coming from near the door. She moved slowly to the window and peered out, then gasped. A large rattlesnake coiled on the porch, directly in front of the door, its triangular head raised and its tail vibrating that terrifying warning. Florence backed away from the window, her heart hammering. She could not leave the house with that creature blocking the door. But Harrison had said he would be gone most of the afternoon, and she had no way to remove the snake herself. She looked at the rifle above the door, but she had never fired a gun in her life and was terrified she would miss and only anger the creature. For several minutes, she simply stood frozen, paralyzed by fear and indecision. Then she remembered the bell. Harrison had said to ring it if she needed help. But was a snake enough of an emergency? Would Miguel think her foolish and weak, unable to cope with the most basic aspects of frontier life? The snake showed no signs of moving, and Florence made her decision. She carefully opened the door just enough to reach the bell, giving the snake a wide berth, and rang it vigorously. The sound clanged across the valley, harsh and urgent. Then she retreated back inside and waited, watching the snake through the window. It remained coiled, apparently content to sun itself on the warm porch boards. Within 10 minutes, Florence saw Miguel riding hard toward the house. He pulled up short when he saw the snake, then dismounted and approached carefully. He picked up a long stick from the woodpile and used it to lift the snake and carry it away from the house, depositing it in the brush a safe distance away. Florence opened the door cautiously as Miguel returned. "I am so sorry," she said, mortified. "I did not know what to do. I have never encountered a rattlesnake before." "You did exactly right," Miguel assured her kindly. "A rattlesnake is dangerous. You do not take chances. Better to ring the bell for a small problem than to risk being bitten trying to solve it yourself. Rattlesnake bites can kill, especially if you are alone and cannot get help quickly." His matter-of-fact acceptance of her fear eased Florence's embarrassment. "Are they common? Common enough that you must always watch where you step," Miguel said. "They like warm places, sunny spots. Check before you sit on the porch or reach into a dark space. Shake out your boots before you put them on in the morning. Usually they will avoid you if they can, but if you surprise them, they will strike. The sound they make, the rattle, is a warning. If you hear it, back away slowly." Florence nodded, trying to commit all this vital information to memory. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Miguel smiled. "That is what neighbors are for. You will learn, Mrs. Harrison. Give yourself time. Nobody knows everything about a new place immediately." He glanced past her into the house and smiled more broadly. "Something smells very good." Florence remembered the bread. "Oh, I have loaves rising. Would you like to stay for coffee and fresh bread when it is done?" "I would like that very much," Miguel said, "but I should get back to work." "Maybe you could save me a slice, and I will enjoy it tomorrow." After Miguel left, Florence tended to her bread, relieved that her first attempt in the new oven produced 2 perfectly respectable loaves. The familiar yeasty smell filled the house, making it feel slightly more like a home. Harrison returned as the sun was beginning to set, dusty and tired. His face lit up when he saw the bread cooling on the table and smelled the stew Florence had attempted for dinner. "You have been busy," he said approvingly, "and that bread looks better than anything I have managed." Over dinner, Florence told him about the snake, feeling her fear rise again in the telling. Harrison listened seriously, not dismissing her fright. "I am sorry I was not here," he said, "but you handled it perfectly. That is exactly what the bell is for. Rattlesnakes are one of the real dangers out here. You must always be cautious." "Miguel taught me what to watch for," Florence said. "He is a good man," Harrison agreed. "The best hand I have ever had and a good friend besides. You can trust him completely." They fell into a routine over the following days that was tentative but workable. Harrison rose before dawn and was often gone most of the day tending the cattle, fixing fences, managing the endless tasks that kept a ranch running. Florence took over the household duties, cooking, cleaning, tending the chickens, attempting to revive the struggling garden. She made mistakes constantly, burning meals, shrinking Harrison's shirt when she tried to wash it in water that was too hot, getting lost when she ventured just a short distance from the house to pick wild herbs Miguel had pointed out to her. But Harrison never criticized, never showed impatience with her ignorance. Instead, he gently corrected her errors and taught her what she needed to know: how to adjust the damper on the stove to control the temperature, how to conserve water, which was too precious to waste, how to recognize which plants were safe and which were poisonous, how to watch the sky for signs of the rare rainstorms that could turn dry washes into raging torrents in minutes. Florence found herself developing a grudging respect for this harsh land and the skills required to survive in it. Everything was harder here. Every task required more effort and knowledge than it had in the city. But there was also a strange beauty to it, a purity in the simplicity of the life. Sunset turned the mountains into works of art. The stars at night were so numerous and bright they seemed close enough to touch. The silence, once terrifying, became peaceful. And slowly, carefully, Florence and Harrison began to know each other. They talked in the evenings after the work was done, sharing stories of their pasts. Harrison spoke of his childhood in Kansas, of the hard work of farm life, of the wanderlust that had driven him west. Florence told him about Boston, about her father and the shock of his death, about the life she had left behind. "You miss it?" Harrison asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. Florence considered the question honestly. "I miss the familiarity of it. I miss knowing how everything works, feeling competent and capable. Here I feel like a child, having to learn the most basic things. But do I miss the city itself? I am not sure. There is something appealing about this life despite its hardships. Everything feels more real somehow, more essential." Harrison nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That is what drew me here. In the city, I always felt like I was just existing, not really living. Here, every day matters. What you do or fail to do has real consequences. It is frightening but also exhilarating." As the weeks passed, Florence noticed changes in herself. Her hands, once soft and pale, became rough and tanned, despite her best efforts to protect them. Her body grew stronger from the constant physical labor. Her initial terror of the frontier eased into a wary respect. She learned to recognize the warning signs of scorpions and to check her boots each morning as Miguel had taught her. She learned to conserve water and to make meals stretch when supplies ran low before the trip to town. She learned to listen to the sounds of the night and distinguish between normal desert noises and something that might signal danger. She also learned to read Harrison, to understand his quiet ways. He was not a man given to flowery speeches or dramatic gestures, but he showed his care through countless small actions. He always brought her wildflowers when he found them. He built a shade structure over the vegetable garden to help the struggling plants. He purchased fabric in her favorite color on their trips to town. He listened when she spoke and remembered details she mentioned in passing. And Florence found herself caring for him in return, wanting to ease his burdens and make his life more comfortable. She learned which meals he preferred and mastered the art of cooking them. She mended his clothes and kept the house clean and welcoming. She listened to his concerns about the ranch and offered what support she could. They were building something together, she realized. Not the passionate romance of novels, perhaps, but something steadier and possibly more lasting. A partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. One evening in late October, nearly 2 months after Florence's arrival, she and Harrison were sitting on the porch enjoying the cooler evening air when a rider approached at speed. Harrison stood immediately, his body tense, and Florence felt her old fears resurface. Visitors at this hour were unusual and potentially meant trouble, but as the rider drew closer, Harrison relaxed. "It is Sheriff Daniels from town." The sheriff was a lean man with a graying beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He touched his hat politely to Florence, then addressed Harrison. "Sorry to bother you folks so late, but we have got a situation I thought you should know about. A gang of outlaws hit the bank in Prescott 2 days ago, killed a teller and wounded the sheriff. They are headed this direction, at least according to the telegraph from the territorial marshal. I am warning everyone to be on their guard." Florence felt her blood run cold. Harrison's face had gone grim. "How many?" "4 men, all armed and considered very dangerous. If they come through Jerome Junction, we will handle them, but I wanted folks on the outlying ranches to be prepared just in case they decide to hole up somewhere remote." After the sheriff left, Harrison immediately began preparing. He brought out a second rifle and showed Florence how to load and fire it, making her practice until she could do it smoothly. He checked all the doors and windows, ensuring they could be secured. He brought the horses into the barn rather than leaving them in the corral where they could easily be stolen. "I am sure they will not come here," he told Florence, though his actions belied his words. "But we must be prepared." That night, Florence lay awake in her room, listening to every sound, imagining danger in every creak and rustle. She knew Harrison was not sleeping either. She could hear him moving around the main room, checking the windows periodically. The next day, Harrison refused to leave her alone. "The cattle can wait," he said firmly. "I am staying close to the house today." They went about their usual tasks, but the easy rhythm they had developed was disrupted by tension and vigilance. Harrison kept a rifle close at hand. Every sound made them both start and look toward the door. It was mid-afternoon when they heard hoofbeats approaching. Harrison grabbed his rifle and positioned himself where he could see out but remain protected. Florence, following his earlier instructions, moved to the bedroom and retrieved the second rifle, her hands shaking but her grip steady. 3 men rode into the yard, and even from inside the house, Florence could see they were trouble. Their clothes were dusty and stained, their faces hard, their weapons prominent. One had a blood-stained bandage around his arm. Harrison opened the door but did not step outside, keeping the solid wood between himself and the riders. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The leader, a man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth, smiled without warmth. "We need fresh horses and supplies. And we would appreciate if you could point us toward Mexico." "I am afraid I cannot help you with any of that," Harrison said calmly, though Florence could see the tension in his shoulders. "I need my horses and my supplies are limited." The leader's smile vanished. "I do not think you understand. We are not asking." "And I am not bargaining," Harrison replied evenly. "You need to move on. There is nothing for you here." One of the other men, a younger fellow with wild eyes, drew his pistol. "Maybe we should just take what we want." Harrison raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at the men but making his readiness clear. "I do not want trouble, but I will not let you rob me. Best you ride on." For a tense moment, the situation balanced on a knife's edge. Florence held her breath, her finger near the trigger of her own rifle, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Then a shot rang out, but not from any of them. A new voice called from behind the outlaws. "Drop your weapons. You are surrounded." Florence risked a glance out the window and saw Miguel and two other men, all armed, positioned strategically around the yard. The outlaws' horses began to dance nervously, and the men looked around, realizing they were outmatched. The leader's face twisted with fury, but he was practical enough to recognize a losing situation. "This is not worth it," he snarled. "Let us go." "You can go," Miguel said calmly, "but leave your weapons. You can collect them from the sheriff in Jerome Junction when you turn yourselves in." More tense moments passed. Then one by one, the outlaws dropped their guns to the ground and rode off, weaponless and furious but alive. Miguel and his companions kept their rifles trained on them until they were out of sight. Harrison finally lowered his weapon and stepped out onto the porch. Florence emerged shakily from the house, her legs unsteady. Miguel approached, his expression serious. "I heard from the sheriff about the outlaws and figured you might want some backup. Looks like I was right to trust my instincts." Harrison clasped his friend's shoulder gratefully. "I owe you." "Again. We look out for each other," Miguel said simply. "That is what neighbors do." The other two men, ranchers from properties farther south, collected the outlaws' weapons and promised to deliver them to the sheriff along with a description of the men. "Sheriff will get word to the territorial marshal," one said. "Unarmed and traveling together, those boys will be easy to track down." After everyone left, Harrison and Florence returned to the house. The danger had passed, but Florence found herself shaking uncontrollably, all the fear she had held at bay during the confrontation flooding through her now. Harrison set down his rifle and turned to her, concern clear on his face. "Are you all right?" "I thought they were going to kill us," Florence whispered. "I thought." "But they did not," Harrison said gently. He crossed the room and for the first time since their chaste wedding kiss touched her with more than polite courtesy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as the shaking continued. "You were so brave, Florence. You did exactly right." Florence pressed her face against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "I was terrified." "So was I," Harrison admitted quietly. "But you stood ready to defend our home anyway. That is what courage is, not the absence of fear, but doing what must be done despite it." Mrs. Patterson's words, so long ago on the train, echoed in Florence's mind. And suddenly, wrapped in her husband's arms, feeling the strength and steadiness of him, something shifted in Florence's heart. This man, this quiet, kind, brave man, had become important to her. Somewhere between the rattlesnake and the bread and the sunset conversations and this moment of shared danger and relief, she had stopped seeing him as a stranger, as simply the solution to her desperate circumstances. She cared about him, genuinely cared. She looked up at him, and something in her expression must have conveyed her feelings because Harrison's eyes widened slightly. He raised one rough hand to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the calluses. "Florence," he said softly, and in that one word she heard a question, a hope, a possibility. She answered by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. Unlike the chaste peck at their wedding, this was a real kiss, tentative at first but deepening as Harrison responded. His arms tightened around her, and Florence felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the desert heat and everything to do with the man holding her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he confessed, "but I did not want to push you, did not want you to feel obligated." "I do not feel obligated," Florence assured him. "I feel—" She searched for the right word. "I feel grateful and safe. And something more, something I am only beginning to understand." Harrison smiled, a real smile that lit up his whole face. "I think I know what you mean, because I feel it too." That night, Florence moved her belongings into the main bedroom, into Harrison's room, and they began their marriage in truth. They came together tentatively at first, strangers learning each other, but with a tenderness and care that made the experience sweet rather than frightening. Harrison was patient and gentle, clearly concerned with her comfort, and Florence found herself responding to him with a passion she had not known she possessed. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, listening to his breathing even out as he fell asleep, Florence felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had been so terrified of this life, of the unknown frontier, of the dangers lurking in every shadow. But she was not alone in facing those dangers. She had a partner, a true partner, someone who would stand with her against whatever came. The life was still hard. Florence continued to struggle with tasks that would have seemed simple to someone raised on the frontier. She burned dinner sometimes, overwatered the garden, accidentally let the chickens escape their coop. But Harrison never made her feel foolish or inadequate. He simply helped her fix her mistakes and taught her how to avoid them in the future. And slowly, Florence grew into her role. By the time winter arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain, she could manage the household efficiently. She could cook meals that Harrison genuinely enjoyed, not just tolerated. She could tend the garden and the chickens, preserve food for the winter, mend and make clothes, manage the dozen daily tasks that kept a frontier household running. More importantly, she had grown to love her life, or perhaps more accurately, to love the man who shared that life with her. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had transformed into something real and deep. She loved the way Harrison's eyes crinkled when he smiled. She loved his quiet competence, the way he could fix anything and solve any problem. She loved his gentleness with the animals and his respect for the land. She loved the way he kissed her good morning and pulled her close at night, and Harrison, she knew, loved her in return. He showed it constantly, in ways both large and small. He built her a proper writing desk when he learned she missed keeping a journal. He fashioned a rocking chair for the porch because she had mentioned her mother once had one. He took her on rides around the ranch, showing her the land he loved, teaching her to see its beauty. He told her she was beautiful, even when she was dusty and sweaty from a day's work, and the way he looked at her made her believe it. Christmas came, and they celebrated simply but joyfully. Harrison surprised her with a bolt of beautiful blue fabric from the general store, far finer than the practical cotton she usually wore, and Florence made herself a dress for church. She surprised him with a new leather belt she had secretly commissioned from the saddle maker in town, with his initials worked into the design. Miguel and his wife Rosa came for Christmas dinner, bringing tamales that Rosa had made. The four of them spent a pleasant evening together, and Florence realized she had found something she had not expected: friends. Rosa was a cheerful woman a few years older than Florence, and she welcomed another woman in the area with genuine warmth. They made plans to visit regularly, and Florence felt a surge of gratitude for this budding friendship. As winter gave way to spring, bringing wildflowers that carpeted the desert in unexpected splashes of color, Florence realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another month to be certain, then shared the news with Harrison one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I believe I am expecting a baby," she said simply. Harrison went very still, then turned to her with wonder written across his face. "Truly." "Truly," Florence confirmed. "If my calculations are correct, the baby should arrive in early September." Harrison pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were something precious and fragile. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby." The pregnancy was not easy. The heat of summer was brutal, and Florence's body grew increasingly uncomfortable as the months passed. Morning sickness plagued her well into her 4th month. But Rosa proved an invaluable source of advice and support, having already raised 3 children of her own. And Harrison treated Florence like she was made of glass, constantly worried about her well-being, insisting she rest more and work less. "I am pregnant, not ill," Florence protested when he tried to take over all her household chores. "I know," Harrison said, "but you are carrying our child, and I will do whatever I can to make it easier for you." His devotion touched her deeply. This man, who had been a stranger less than a year ago, had become her entire world. She could hardly remember the frightened woman who had stepped off the train in Jerome Junction, terrified of the frontier and everything it represented. That woman seemed like a stranger now. In early September, as the heat finally began to break, Florence went into labor. Rosa and her mother, an experienced midwife, came to assist. Harrison paced outside, too nervous to be in the room but too concerned to go far. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next afternoon, but finally, as the sun began its descent, Florence delivered a healthy baby boy. When Rosa brought the baby to Harrison, cleaned and wrapped in a soft blanket, he cradled his son with awestruck reverence. Then he came to Florence, who lay exhausted but glowing with relief and joy, and sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "He is perfect," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are amazing. Thank you." Florence looked at her husband and their son and felt her heart overflow. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names, but Harrison said, "I thought, if you agree, we might name him Henry, after your father." Tears filled Florence's eyes. She had told Harrison so much about her father, about how much she had loved him despite his flaws, about how she wished he could have met the man who had given her such a good life. "Henry Harrison Jameson," she said. "It is perfect." The early months with baby Henry were exhausting but joyful. Florence learned to function on little sleep, to balance the baby's constant needs with the demands of running the household. Harrison helped as much as he could, walking the floor with a fussy Henry in the evenings, giving Florence breaks when he could see her reaching her limits. They settled into a new rhythm, now a family of 3. Miguel and Rosa became honorary uncle and aunt, doting on Henry whenever they visited. The ranch continued to prosper as Harrison's hard work paid off. He was able to expand the herd, and even hired an additional hand to help Miguel with the increased workload. On their first wedding anniversary, Harrison and Florence celebrated with a quiet dinner after putting Henry to bed. As they sat together on the porch in the comfortable darkness, Florence reflected on everything that had changed in a single year. "I was so frightened when I came here," she said softly. "I thought I would never adapt, never belong in this place. And now?" Harrison asked, pulling her close against his side. "Now I cannot imagine being anywhere else," Florence said honestly. "This is my home. You are my home. I was so scared of the frontier, of everything it represented, but you became my courage, Harrison. You helped me see that I was stronger than I knew, that I could face things I never thought possible. And somewhere along the way, this wild, harsh place became beautiful to me, because you are here." Harrison kissed her temple, his arm tightening around her. "You gave me something I did not even know I needed," he said quietly. "I thought I wanted a wife to help with the work, someone to share the burden of frontier life. But you gave me so much more. You gave me a real home, a family, someone to build dreams with rather than just survive with." "I love you, Florence, more than I ever thought possible to love someone." "I love you too," Florence whispered. "So much." They sat together in the peaceful darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the desert night, content in each other's presence. The life was still hard. There would be challenges ahead, setbacks and struggles inevitable in frontier life. But they would face those challenges together, lending each other strength and courage. The months turned into years, and the Jameson family continued to grow and thrive. When Henry was 2, Florence gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, with dark hair like her father and her mother's gray eyes. 2 years after that came another son, James, who proved to have his father's quiet temperament and his mother's quick mind. The ranch expanded, becoming one of the most successful in the region. Harrison and Miguel brought in more hands to help manage the growing operation. Florence became known in Jerome Junction for her skills at preserving food and her beautifully made quilts, which she occasionally sold at the general store. She formed deep friendships with Rosa and several other women in the area, creating a small but supportive community. The territory changed around them as well. The railroad expanded, bringing more people and more commerce. Jerome Junction grew from a rough frontier town into a proper settlement with a school, a new church, and multiple stores. The Apache troubles faded into history as the last holdouts were confined to reservations or fled into Mexico. Outlaws became less common as law enforcement strengthened. The wild, dangerous frontier Florence had so feared gradually transformed into merely the West, still rugged but increasingly civilized. Through all these changes, Harrison and Florence's love deepened and matured. They weathered dry years when the creek ran dangerously low, and they worried about the cattle. They survived a terrible winter when Henry fell ill with pneumonia, and they spent weeks nursing him back to health. They dealt with the normal struggles of raising children, of keeping a ranch running, of navigating the challenges life presented. But they dealt with everything together, as true partners. When Florence's courage failed, Harrison lent her his strength. When Harrison doubted himself or his decisions, Florence reminded him of all they had overcome, all they had built together. They had become each other's refuge, each other's greatest supporter. One evening, when they had been married nearly 15 years, Florence and Harrison took a rare evening ride together, leaving the children in Miguel and Rosa's care. They rode up into the foothills, to a spot that offered a spectacular view of the valley and their ranch spread below. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Their house looked small from this height, but they could see the lamplight in the windows. The neat garden Florence had finally coaxed into flourishing, the expanded barn and corrals, the herd of cattle grazing peacefully. "Do you ever regret answering my advertisement?" Harrison asked suddenly. Florence looked at her husband, this man who had given her not just security but love, not just shelter but a true home. His hair was beginning to gray at the temples, and lines creased the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the bright sun. He was weathered and worn from hard work, but to her he had never been more handsome. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. I gained everything when I came here. A husband I love beyond measure, children who are the joy of my life, a home I helped build, friends who are like family, a life that matters. Even though it is so different from what you knew," Harrison pressed. "Even though it was so hard at first." "Especially because it was hard," Florence said. "The easy path would have left me in Boston, probably dead in some factory accident or worse. This path, the hard one, gave me everything worth having. Yes, I was terrified of the frontier, but you became my courage, Harrison. You helped me find strength I did not know I had, and this harsh, beautiful land became my home because you were here to share it with me." Harrison reached over and took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I think about that scared young woman who stepped off the train in Jerome Junction, and I can hardly believe she is the same person sitting beside me now. You have become so strong, so capable. You belong to this land now as much as it belongs to you. We built this life together, Florence said. Your courage gave me the strength to face my fears. Your love gave me a reason to try. I was not brave when I came here. I was desperate. But you taught me that courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward despite it. And together, we can face anything. They sat together on the hillside as the sun sank below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge, countless and brilliant in the vast desert sky. Below them, their home waited, warm and welcoming. Their children were safe and happy. Their future was secure, built on hard work and mutual respect and deep, abiding love. Florence had traveled across a continent to marry a stranger out of desperation and fear. But she had found something far more valuable than mere security. She had found her home, her courage, and a love that would sustain her through all the years to come. The frightened mail-order bride had become a strong, confident woman, wife, mother, and rancher. And it had all begun with one brave decision, and one good man who saw her potential even when she could not see it herself. As they rode back down to the ranch under the star-filled sky, Florence felt only gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, for every challenge overcome and every fear conquered. This life, this man, this home, they were everything she had never known to hope for. And she would not trade them for anything the world had to offer. Years continued to pass peacefully. Henry grew into a young man who shared his father's love of ranching and his mother's sharp mind. He began taking on more responsibility at the ranch, learning the business from Harrison with the goal of eventually taking over. Margaret proved to have a gift with horses, able to gentle even the most skittish animals with patience and intuition. Young James showed an interest in books and learning that eventually led him to study law in Tucson, though he always returned home for holidays and visits. Harrison and Florence grew old together, their love only deepening with time. They became grandparents when Henry married a local girl and started his own family in a house Harrison helped him build on the western edge of the ranch property. Margaret eventually married a veterinarian who moved to Jerome Junction to set up practice, and they built a small house in town. Even James, despite his life in Tucson, brought his wife home often enough that their children knew their grandparents well. Florence and Harrison's golden years were spent much as their younger days had been, working the ranch they loved, surrounded by family and friends, watching the land and their legacy flourish. The ranch that had started as a simple homestead had become a substantial operation, proof of what dedication and partnership could achieve. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration at the ranch. Children and grandchildren filled the house that Florence and Harrison had built together. Miguel and Rosa were there too, now grandparents themselves. The party spilled out onto the porch and into the yard, full of laughter and love. As the evening wound down and the grandchildren were settling in for the night, Florence and Harrison slipped away to their favorite spot on the porch. They sat in the rocking chairs Harrison had built years ago, holding hands and watching the sun set over their land. 40 years, Florence marveled. When I think about that frightened girl on the train, I can hardly believe how far we have come. You were never just a frightened girl, Harrison said gently. You were brave enough to take a chance, strong enough to face your fears, wise enough to build something meaningful from uncertain beginnings. We built it together, Florence corrected. I would never have survived here without you, never become the person I am now without your patience and love. Harrison smiled, the same warm smile that had won her heart so many years ago. We saved each other, I think. I was just existing before you came, going through the motions of life without really living. You brought light and love and purpose to everything." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the stars emerged. Inside the house, they could hear their family, the voices of children and grandchildren, the sound of home and happiness. "I have no regrets," Florence said softly. "Not a single one. Every challenge, every moment of fear, every hardship, it was all worth it to end up here now with you and the family we built together." "Neither do I," Harrison agreed, squeezing her hand gently. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Florence Jameson. My partner, my love, my home." As they rocked together in the darkness, surrounded by the land they had tamed and the family they had raised, Florence thought about the long journey that had brought her here. She had been so terrified of the frontier, of the unknown, of stepping into a life she could not imagine. But that fear had led her to the greatest adventure of her life, to a love deeper than she had dreamed possible, to a home that was truly hers. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Jerome Junction 40 years ago, frightened and uncertain, had found everything she never knew she needed. She had found courage in the strong, steady man beside her. She had found home in the harsh, beautiful land around her. She had found herself in the challenges she overcame and the life she built, and in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything. As the years advanced into their 70s, Harrison and Florence gradually handed over more responsibilities to Henry and his wife Sarah, though neither could entirely give up working. Harrison still rode out to check on the cattle most mornings, and Florence still tended her garden and managed the household accounts. They had earned their rest, but neither knew quite how to stop being useful. Florence had become a pillar of the community, serving as the unofficial historian of Jerome Junction, remembering everyone's stories and preserving the history of the early days. She was sought out for advice on everything from recipes to child rearing to navigating the challenges of frontier life. Though the frontier was long gone by then, replaced by the early 20th century's comforts. Harrison served on the town council and was respected throughout the region as a fair dealer and knowledgeable rancher. Young men came from other ranches to learn from him, and he was always generous with his time and wisdom. On a warm spring evening in their 47th year of marriage, as they sat on their porch watching yet another spectacular sunset, Harrison turned to Florence with a serious expression. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. Florence felt a flutter of concern. "What is it?" "I have been thinking about everything we have built here, everything we have accomplished together," Harrison said, his weathered hand tightening around hers. "And I realized I have never properly thanked you." "Thanked me?" Florence asked, surprised. "For what?" "For taking a chance on a stranger," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "For being brave enough to come to this wild place. For building a home and a family with me. For loving me even when I was rough and ignorant about so many things. For being my partner in every way that matters. My life would have been empty without you, Florence. You filled it with meaning and joy and love." Tears filled Florence's eyes. "Oh, Harrison, I should be thanking you. You gave me a home when I had none. You saw potential in me when I could not see it myself. You taught me courage and strength. You loved me through all my mistakes and fears. Everything good in my life came from that day you met my train." "Then we will call it even," Harrison said with a gentle smile. "Two desperate people who found each other and built something beautiful." "More than even," Florence corrected. "We are blessed beyond measure." They continued to rock together, hands clasped, hearts full, as the sun completed its descent and the first stars appeared. Around them, the ranch bustled with activity even in the evening hours. They could hear Henry calling instructions to one of the hands. Sarah's voice drifted from the kitchen where she was preparing tomorrow's meals. Grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. This was legacy, Florence thought. Not just the land or the cattle or even the family, though those were all important. The real legacy was the love they had built together, the partnership that had sustained them through decades of joy and hardship. That was what would endure long after they were gone. Time continued its relentless march. There were more grandchildren, then great-grandchildren. Jerome Junction transformed from a rough frontier town into a proper city with paved streets and electric lights. The ranch continued to prosper under Henry's management, incorporating new techniques and technologies while maintaining the core values Harrison had established. Harrison passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, with Florence beside him as she had been for nearly half a century. She held his hand as his breathing slowed and finally stopped, and though her heart broke, she was grateful that he had gone peacefully, without pain or suffering. The funeral brought people from all over Arizona territory, testimony to the impact Harrison had made during his life. Florence stood surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, drawing strength from the family they had created together. In the months that followed, Florence continued to live in the house she and Harrison had shared, surrounded by memories of their life together. She spent her days in the garden with her family and rocking on the porch where they had passed so many evenings. She told stories to her great-grandchildren about the old days, about the wild frontier that had so terrified her, about the good man who had become her courage and her home. 3 years after Harrison's death, Florence joined him. She passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 81 in the bed she had shared with him for so many years. Her family mourned but also celebrated a life well lived, a love that had endured through nearly 5 decades, and a legacy that would continue through the generations. She was buried beside Harrison on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, their headstones marking not just their deaths but their enduring partnership. The inscription Florence had requested for Harrison's stone read, "Harrison Jameson, beloved husband, father, and friend. He gave courage to those who had none." And on her own stone, placed beside his, "Florence Harper Jameson, beloved wife, mother, and friend, she found home in the wild places." Together in death as they had been in life, they rested in the land they had loved, the land that had challenged and shaped them, the land where a frightened mail-order bride had found courage, love, and belonging in the arms of a lonely cowboy who had offered her not just marriage but true partnership. Their story became part of the ranch's history, passed down through generations. Henry told his children, who told theirs, about the grandmother who had come west with nothing but a carpetbag and a desperate hope, and the grandfather who had seen past her fear to the strength beneath. About how they had built something lasting together, not just a ranch but a real home, not just a family but a legacy of love. The ranch remained in the Jameson family for generations, each successive owner maintaining the values Harrison and Florence had established. Hard work, fair dealing, respect for the land, and above all, the understanding that true strength comes not from facing the world alone but from building partnerships based on mutual respect and love. And on quiet evenings, when the sunset painted the Arizona sky in brilliant colors and the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods, those who knew the story could almost see them there still, sitting together on the porch of the home they had built. The mail-order bride who had been so frightened of the frontier and the cowboy who had become her courage, her partner, her home, and her greatest love. 2 people who had found each other across impossible distances and built something that would endure long after they were gone. Their love story was not the dramatic romance of novels, full of grand gestures and flowery speeches. It was something quieter but more profound, built on shared work and mutual respect, on patient teaching and willing learning, on facing fears together and celebrating victories as a team. It was the kind of love that endures, that deepens with time rather than fading, that transforms two individuals into something greater than either could have been alone. And in the end, that was perhaps the greatest legacy of all. Not the ranch or the wealth or even the family, as important as those were, but the proof that love, real lasting love, could be found in the most unexpected places and circumstances. That courage could be borrowed and shared. That home was not a place but a person, or two people who chose each other and built a life together against all odds. The story of Harrison and Florence Jameson remained a testament to the power of partnership, the strength found in vulnerability, and the beautiful truth that sometimes the things that frighten us most lead us to exactly where we are meant to be. She had been scared of the frontier, but it had given her everything. He had been lonely and isolated, but she had filled his life with warmth and meaning. Together, they had turned fear into courage, loneliness into belonging, and uncertainty into a love that lasted through the decades and beyond. Their story was complete, their ending peaceful and happy, surrounded by the fruits of their long partnership. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that would endure for generations. And that was more than enough. It was everything.